Flight Sergeant Tota Ishii pulled back on the control stick of his Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate on April 7, 1945, climbing hard through 20,000 feet above Tokyo as his engine coughed and trailed dark smoke. The single-stage supercharger struggled to compress the thin morning air, while the radio crackled with urgent warnings that American bombers were approaching from the south, and he had been scrambled along with more than 100 fighters from multiple airfields around the capital to intercept them. Then he saw something that seemed impossible, because his commanders had assured him repeatedly that no American land-based fighter could reach Japan from their island bases 750 miles away, that the mathematics didn't work, and the fuel capacity simply didn't exist to make such a flight possible. But there they were with their distinctive profiles unmistakable against the clear morning sky. Single-engine fighters, American fighters over Tokyo, dozens of them escorting a formation of B-29 superfortresses in a site that violated everything he'd been told. North American P-51 Mustangs flying silver in the sunlight, as if they owned Japanese airspace, and in that instant, Ishii understood something his superiors had refused to accept, which was that the war was truly lost, because if American fighters could reach the capital, then nowhere in Japan was safe. The capture of Iwo Jima in March 1945 had given the United States Army Air Forces a forward base just 750 statute miles from Tokyo, and the island was barely 8 square miles of volcanic rock and black sand that had cost nearly 7,000 American Marines their lives. Another 20,000 were wounded as Japanese defenders dug into tunnels and fortified positions fought with suicidal determination, killing or wounding 1/3 of the entire landing force. But the strategic value of those blood-soaked beaches would soon become devastatingly clear. Within weeks of securing the island, construction battalions were expanding the existing Japanese airstrips and building new facilities, and by early April, 3 fighter groups were operational on Iwo Jima, with their mission unprecedented in the history of air warfare. Very Long-Range Escort, abbreviated VLR, was a concept military planners had initially dismissed as fantasy, because flying single-engine fighters 750 miles over open ocean, engaging enemy fighters over their home territory, then flying 750 miles back required a margin for error that was essentially zero. Navigation had to be perfect, weather forecasting had to be accurate, and the fighters themselves had to possess range capabilities that no aircraft in the world had demonstrated except one, and the North American P-51D Mustang was about to prove that the impossible was merely difficult. The P-51D represented the culmination of an extraordinary international collaboration between American aerodynamic innovation and British engine technology that began in 1940 when the design was originally created for export to Britain. Early Allison-powered variants showed promise but lacked high-altitude performance until British engineers at Rolls-Royce recognized the airframe's potential and suggested mating it with their Merlin engine, creating a transformation that proved revolutionary. The Packard P-1657, which was a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66, delivered 1,695 horsepower at takeoff with water injection that increased to 1,720 horsepower in emergency war-power settings. The engine's 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger maintained high performance at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air because the first stage compressed incoming air, an intercooler reduced its temperature, then the second stage compressed it further. This delivered oxygen-rich mixture to the cylinders even at 40,000 feet, where the P-51D could reach a maximum speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, with an operational ceiling approaching 42,000 feet. But speed and altitude were only part of the equation because the true revolution lay in range that no other fighter could match, and with 2 110-gallon drop tanks mounted under the wings, Mustangs could fly combat missions of 1,600 statute miles. This was achieved through Edgar Schmood's laminar flow wing design that maintained smooth airflow over 70% of the wing surface, reducing parasitic drag by approximately 35% compared to conventional airfoils. When combined with the Merlin engine's exceptional fuel efficiency at cruise power settings, consuming just 65 gallons per hour, the P-51D could stay airborne for over 7 hours without refueling. Armament consisted of 6 wing-mounted M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns where the inboard guns carried 400 rounds each, while the center and outboard positions held 270 rounds each, totaling 1,880 rounds of ammunition. Each gun fired at 800 rounds per minute to deliver 4,800 rounds per minute of combined firepower, with armor-piercing incendiary rounds weighing 46 grams and traveling at 2,900 feet per second. These rounds were capable of penetrating aircraft armor, igniting fuel tanks, and destroying engines with concentrated fire, and by war's end, North American aviation had produced 15,586 P-51s of all variants. The D model alone accounted for 8,156 aircraft, where at peak production, a new Mustang rolled off the assembly line every hour from factories in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, representing industrial capacity that exceeded Japan's total fighter production for the final 2 years of the war. Dawn broke over Iwo Jima at 05:45 hours on April 7, 1945, and the 3 fighter groups had been briefed the previous evening about an unprecedented mission. 91 P-51D Mustangs would escort 103 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses on a daylight raid against aircraft factories in the Tokyo area, and the round-trip distance of approximately 1,500 statute miles required nearly 7 hours airborne time. Major James Tapp of the 15th Fighter Group performed his pre-flight inspection in the pre-dawn darkness by checking the 110-gallon drop tanks mounted under each wing, verifying the ammunition counters showed full loads, and ensuring his oxygen system was functioning properly. He knew the auxiliary fuel tanks would be dropped when Japanese fighters appeared because their weight and drag would become a liability in combat, and at 06:30 hours, the Mustangs began their takeoff roll from Iwo's south field. One after another, they thundered down the runway that was still under construction in places before climbing into the morning sky, and the formation assembled over Mount Suribachi, with its distinctive profile rising 554 feet above the volcanic beaches where Marines had died weeks earlier. The flight north was conducted in radio silence as pilots navigated by dead reckoning, where compass headings were carefully calculated to account for wind drift and magnetic variation, and below them stretched the vast Pacific that was empty and trackless. There were no landmarks, no roads, and no visual references except the ocean's endless blue, where if an engine failed or navigation was off by even a few degrees, the result would be the same: a slow descent into cold water and death. At 0700 hours, approximately 75 miles south of Tokyo, the formations rendezvoused as the B-29s completed their assembly by turning in a wide circle at 25,000 feet, and Captain Artbridge later recalled the sight of sunlight glinting off aluminum skin. The bombers stretched across the sky like a school of silver fish swimming through blue water, and then came the warning call over the radio. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. If you want to see how American pilots with superior aircraft and training turned this battle into a one-sided massacre that revealed Japan's complete industrial collapse, hit that like button and subscribe, because every like and subscription helps the channel. Let's continue with the air battle. The Japanese had scrambled every available fighter within range of Tokyo from Chofu, Tachikawa, Yokota, Narimasu, and a dozen other airfields where more than 100 fighters were clawing for altitude. The formations included Nakajima Ki-84 Hayates, older Ki-43 Hayabusas, Ki-44 Shukis, Ki-61 Hyans, and Navy fighters including A6M0s and the new N1K2J Shidonkais, and what they encountered shattered every assurance their commanders had provided. Land-based American fighters were over Tokyo, flying with apparent confidence at 25,000 feet, hundreds of miles from the nearest American base, and the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. If American fighters could reach the capital and escort bombers anywhere over Japan, then no target was safe because no factory, no city, and no airfield could be defended effectively against this level of air superiority. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces with over 60 victories, was among the defenders that morning, and he later wrote about the moment he identified the P-51s, that a feeling of cold despair swept through him. These were not Navy fighters from carriers that would have to return quickly to their ships, but land-based fighters with range Japan could not match, and he knew immediately that the situation was hopeless, because how could they defend Japan when the enemy could strike anywhere, anytime, with complete air superiority that couldn't be challenged? The engagement began at 0712 hours, when the first wave of Ki-84 Hayates attempted a head-on pass against the B-29 formation. But the Mustangs positioned 5,000 feet above the bombers in a flexible weave pattern dove through the Japanese formation before the attackers could press their runs. Major James Tapp identified a Ki-84 pulling up from a diving attack and rolled inverted before pulling through to follow, and he opened fire at 300 yards as his 6 Brownings hammered for 3 seconds with tracers walking across the Hayate's wing route. Pieces flew off as the Japanese fighter rolled left trailing smoke and began a steep descent that would end in the Pacific Ocean or a crash landing. And the tactical discipline displayed by American pilots reflected 3 years of hard-won lessons from Europe and the Pacific. They fought in pairs with each element providing mutual support, maintained altitude advantage using dive and zoom tactics that exploited the P-51's superior speed and power-to-weight ratio, and conserved ammunition by firing short, accurate bursts rather than extended sprays that wasted precious rounds. Japanese pilots, by contrast, often fought alone because their traditional 3-plane Shotai formations had broken down due to lack of coordination and inadequate radio communication. And many radios had been removed to save weight, while others didn't function properly due to poor quality control in late-war manufacturing. Pilots could not coordinate attacks or warn each other of threats, creating isolated combats where American teamwork overwhelmed Japanese individual skill, regardless of how experienced the Japanese pilot might be. The performance disparity became most evident above 20,000 feet, where the P-51's 2-stage supercharger maintained near sea-level power, while Japanese engines equipped with single-stage superchargers suffered dramatic power loss. The Ki-84, which could theoretically reach 427 miles per hour at optimum altitude, with high-octane fuel and perfect maintenance, struggled to achieve 350 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, with the low-grade fuel and poor maintenance available in 1945. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen of the 78th Fighter Squadron described a typical engagement where they spotted Japanese fighters climbing to intercept and leaving dark exhaust trails. But by the time they reached American altitude, their engines were running rough. The Japanese engines were probably running too rich because their superchargers couldn't compress enough air properly, and the Mustangs would dive through them, fire, and climb away before they could react, because their best pilots might have given them trouble, but most of those men were dead. The Mustang's 650 caliber guns proved devastatingly effective, because at convergence range, all 6 guns concentrated fire in a 30-inch circle, and the armor-piercing incendiary rounds penetrated armor plate while puncturing self-sealing fuel tanks when concentrated fire overwhelmed their capacity. They destroyed engines with hits to cylinder heads, cooling systems, or supercharger components, creating catastrophic failures that left Japanese aircraft falling from the sky in flames or trailing smoke. Japanese fighters, by comparison, carried mixed armament, where the Ki-84 standard configuration included two 12.7mm OH-103 machine guns in the fuselage with 350 rounds each, and two 20mm Ho-5 cannons in the wings with 150 rounds each. Though the cannons delivered heavier punch per hit, their low ammunition capacity and slower rate of fire required precise aim, and inexperienced pilots often missed entirely or exhausted their ammunition after a few bursts before accomplishing anything meaningful. The first mission ended at 09:45 hours, when the last Mustangs cleared the Japanese coast heading south toward Iwo Jima. And behind them, Tokyo burned as the B-29s had dropped their incendiary loads on target, while the P-51s held off Japanese interceptors. American pilots claimed 21 confirmed kills, 5 probables, and 7 damaged aircraft, with 2 P-51s lost and 1 pilot killed, creating a 10-to-1 kill ratio on the first mission that would only improve as the campaign continued through the following months. The air battle over Tokyo reflected deeper systemic failures that had doomed Japan's war effort from the beginning, because American industry operated at peak efficiency, producing aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, while Japanese manufacturing was collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing, resource shortages, and quality control breakdowns. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate had entered service in June 1944 as Japan's answer to American technological superiority, with specifications that appeared competitive on paper, and the Nakajima Hamar Hay-45 radial engine was an 18-cylinder design with fuel injection and water methanol boost, rated at 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. Initial prototypes demonstrated speeds approaching 430 miles per hour, which seemed impressive in testing. But the reality in operational service told a catastrophically different story. By 1945, Japanese factories could no longer maintain quality standards because steel contained impurities that made proper heat treatment impossible, and landing gear struts, manufactured from substandard steel, collapsed on landing at alarming rates. These failures destroyed aircraft and killed pilots, while engine components machined to insufficient tolerances caused excessive wear and frequent failures, and fuel injection systems clogged with debris from poorly refined gasoline that contained contaminants. Pilots reported engines that barely started in the morning, ran rough at all power settings throughout the flight, and often failed catastrophically while in combat or during landing approach, creating a reliability crisis that grounded more aircraft than enemy action destroyed. The fuel situation alone revealed the depth of Japan's industrial crisis, because while American pilots flew with 100-octane aviation gasoline refined from Texas crude and formulated specifically for high-performance engines, Japanese pilots made do with whatever could be produced domestically or synthesized from coal and pine root oil, late-war Japanese aviation fuel. They were producing one complete aircraft every hour in output that exceeded Japan's total fighter production of all types for the war's final 2 years. The training disparity proved equally devastating because by April 1945, most of Japan's experienced pilots were dead after being lost over the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, and in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Replacement pilots received as little as 30 to 50 hours of flight training before being thrown into combat, where they had minimal gunnery practice due to ammunition shortages, no instrument training for flying in clouds or bad weather, and combat tactics learned from outdated manuals rather than experienced instructors who were all dead or flying combat missions. American pilots arriving at Iwo Jima typically had 400 to 600 hours of flight time, including 100 hours specifically in the P-51, and they received extensive gunnery training against towed targets until Deflection shooting became instinctive. They had instrument training in all weather conditions and combat tactics taught by instructors with actual combat experience, and they practiced formation flying until it became automatic and learned energy management and mutual support tactics refined through 3 years of air combat. This produced kill ratios that bordered on massacre as the VLR campaign continued through spring and summer 1945, and American pilots routinely achieved 15-1, 20-1, and even 30-1 kill ratios against Japanese defenders. These Japanese pilots were often teenagers with barely enough training to take off and land safely who were being sent to die against opponents they had no realistic chance of defeating. Every mission from Iwo Jima required navigation across 750 miles of featureless ocean, with no landmarks and no visual references except occasional clouds and the endless blue water below. Radio navigation aids were primitive, and dead reckoning using compass headings and time-distance calculations determined whether pilots found their target or became lost over the Pacific with no way home. The magnetic variation between Iwo Jima and Tokyo was approximately 3 degrees west, with Tokyo lying between the 139th and 140th meridians east, while Iwo Jima sat between the 141st and 142nd meridians. This was a fortunate geographic coincidence that simplified navigation because pilots could fly north-northwest to Japan and south-southeast back to Iwo, knowing that even if weather deteriorated or they became disoriented in combat, a southerly heading would eventually bring them within sight of Mount Suribachi. Weather briefings before each mission compiled data from submarines stationed along the route and reconnaissance aircraft where forecasters predicted winds aloft, cloud cover, visibility, and storm systems. This allowed pilots to adjust their headings for wind drift and plan fuel consumption accurately, while Japanese pilots increasingly flew with outdated maps and unreliable compasses that hadn't been properly calibrated in years. They had no weather information beyond what they could observe from the ground, and their navigation training was minimal because many had never flown more than 100 miles from their home airfield before being ordered to intercept bombers approaching from unknown directions. If forced down over water, American pilots could rely on an elaborate rescue system with submarines designated as lifeguards stationed along the flight path, and PBY Catalina flying boats painted bright yellow and nicknamed Dumbos flew search patterns to locate downed airmen. Life rafts carried emergency rations, water purification tablets, signal mirrors, and dye markers, and rescue rates for American pilots forced down within 100 miles of friendly forces exceeded 50%. Japanese pilots had no such support because their life rafts, when available, often leaked due to deteriorated rubber from years of storage. Emergency rations had usually been consumed by hungry ground crews before the pilot ever received the raft, and there were no rescue aircraft and no submarines to search for survivors. If forced down over water, Japanese pilots died from exposure or drowning, and this knowledge affected combat behavior profoundly. American pilots could fight aggressively, knowing that if shot down, they had a reasonable chance of rescue and returning to combat within days, while Japanese pilots understood that any mission might be their last. Mechanical failure or combat damage meant certain death, and their sacrifice would accomplish nothing except a few more hours of futile resistance, creating a psychological burden that was crushing. Yet they flew anyway, morning after morning. They climbed into aircraft they knew were inferior, while burning fuel they knew was inadequate, and facing opponents they knew they couldn't defeat, continuing to fight because orders demanded it and honor required it, even though everyone understood the war was already lost. The April 7th mission established a pattern that continued until Japan's surrender in August, as VLR missions became routine with fighter groups from Iwo Jima ranging across Japan. They escorted bombers, strafed airfields, attacked shipping, and shot down any aircraft that attempted to interfere. And by May, American pilots were reporting that Japanese fighters rarely engaged with intent to win. Many simply avoided combat to preserve their aircraft for the anticipated invasion of the home islands, while others made half-hearted attacks before breaking away. And the aggressive, determined Japanese pilots of 1942 and 1943 were gone after being killed in 3 years of attrition warfare. The statistics from the VLR campaign demonstrated total American air superiority because between April and August 1945, P-51s based on Iwo Jima flew thousands of sorties over Japan. They destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft in air combat and hundreds more on the ground, while American losses totaled fewer than 30 fighters to all causes, including accidents and mechanical failures, and the kill ratio exceeded 10-to-1 overall, while reaching 20-to-1 or higher on many missions. This represented not just tactical superiority, but total systemic dominance, where better aircraft, better pilots, better training, better logistics, better intelligence, and unlimited industrial capacity combined to produce an outcome that was never in doubt once the P-51s appeared over Tokyo. For Japanese pilots like Flight Sergeant Tota Ishii, who survived the war, the memory of that April morning remained vivid decades later because the sight of American fighters over Tokyo flying with casual confidence through airspace that Japan could no longer defend marked the moment when abstract defeat became concrete reality. Though the war continued for another 4 months with B-29s burning Japan's cities, atomic bombs falling on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Soviets invading Manchuria, for those who saw the Mustangs over Tokyo, the end had arrived that April morning. Everything afterward was merely confirmation of what they already knew, and the very long-range fighter campaign over Japan demonstrated a fundamental truth of modern warfare, that victory belongs not to the brave or the determined, but to those who can combine courage with industrial capacity. Japanese pilots fought with extraordinary determination, and many were brave beyond measure while flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate fuel against overwhelming odds, and their sacrifice and suffering were real but unable to overcome systemic failure that no amount of individual courage could remedy. The P-51 Mustang over Tokyo represented more than American technological achievement, because it symbolized the complete integration of research, industry, training, logistics, and combat doctrine into a military system that Japan could not match. Every Mustang that appeared over the home islands carried with it the accumulated knowledge of 3 years of global warfare, the output of factories producing aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, and pilots trained to standards that Japan's collapsing system could no longer approach. This made the final months of the war a one-sided slaughter, from which there was no escape and no redemption, only the grinding mathematics of industrial supremacy turning brave men into statistics. Let us know where you're watching from, because we'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy carefully researched military history content that examines how industrial capacity and technological innovation determine warfare's outcomes more than battlefield courage alone, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We will love to see you again in the next one. Thank you.